Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ken Yates and I'll be your unit coordinator this semester. My contact email is up there on the screen. So if you need to get in touch about issues with the course, I'm your point of contact. I'm also going to be able to be contacted for student consults using Zoom software. Some of you may have come across this before. It's basically like a fancy version of Skype. So the way that you would arrange that is to email me and we'll work out an agreed time. Now, this unit is going to look at the theory, politics, and practice of crime prevention. So we're going to look at, current approaches and frameworks to this idea of crime prevention and have a think about how effective these things are and look at emerging strategies in the field. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a range of concepts, applying a critical lens to them, and try to integrate that into a holistic understanding of the topic. This unit has three key learning outcomes. The first is to critically analyze policies and practices of crime prevention. The second is to evaluate the links between victimization from crime, fear of crime, and social disadvantage. And the third outcome is to articulate the links between victimization and different crime prevention measures and evaluate the possible strengths and weaknesses of these measures. Okay. Now, this unit has three assessment components. The first is a research exercise, which is a research essay based on a particular case study, and that's worth 1,000 words. And you'll find that that's due on the 1st of September and it's worth 30%. The second assessment is an essay plan, which is basically an annotated bibliography of 500 words, and that's going to be due on the 18th of September, and that's worth 15%. The third assessment, the essay, builds on the work started in the annotated bibliography. So that final essay is going to be worth 1,500 words, and that's going to be due on the 22nd of October for a value of 55%. So it's important to understand that the essay plan and the essay are two connected assessments. The plan feeds into the final essay. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, all right, well, cool, and how do I actually pass this course? I've got a few tips up here on the screen that should, help you with this task. And I think the first one to really consider is time management, okay? Make sure you know what's due and when, and organize your time to make sure that you can complete relevant tasks and preparation for the unit. Another really obvious one is just show up to class. That really helps. Now, obviously, we have busy lives and sometimes unavoidable things happen, but if you're at university, I'm assuming that your education is an important priority in your life, so it does help to take part in tutorial activities, be there, make sure you've watched the lecture and that you're up to speed, and so on. And that also encompasses completing relevant online tasks or activities, as these are useful supplements, will help you understand the material better. If there are discussion boards on views, have a look at those, answer a question, ask a question, that helps. Complete the assessments, that's kind of key to the game here. And something you might want to consider is if you've got a couple of friends doing the unit, you may want to form a study group. You'll have to excuse the picture from community, but I just thought that that's, a useful thing, a reading group or a study group where you discuss the materials and come to grips with it. That's a useful way to learn ideas and concepts that you're not familiar with. So at this stage, I've incorporated a bit of a time management activity. And what you might want to do is pause the lecture at this point and make a note of these due dates in your diary or calendar app. And if you don't use one of these already, I strongly recommend you start getting into the habit. It really helps you manage your time and get things done. And as I've been saying, good time management equals good grades. So, as we approach the topic and ease ourselves into it, um, there are a few, sort of philosophical, theoretical considerations we want to take on board. Now, what I've got here up on the slide is approaching the subject intelligently. And here are a few points to help us get into the sort of mindset we'll need to approach this material. The most important thing, and not just for this topic, but for any really, is to be aware of your own taken for granted definitions and assumptions. These, we inherit from friends, family, the news, and aren't necessarily going to be accurate or useful in any rigorous scholarly sense. So be mindful of that. Also, as I'm sure you're no doubt aware, crime, law and order, those sorts of topics can become very emotive and politically charged. And lots of people, your friends, family, colleagues, politicians, media, will have an opinion, or we might say a feel opinion, about these issues, which basically means everyone has got something to say, but not everyone is going to be the most relevant, reliable, or appropriate source on the topic. Now, it's also important to develop sound theoretical and empirical understandings. This helps us sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. It helps us figure out which ideas are relevant and important and empirically and theoretically useful, and which are just, myths and legends sprouted by popular discourse. Now, students taking this course will learn to navigate some of these important issues in the field. You'll be equipped with the knowledge and understanding um, how to navigate and interpret these issues, what's relevant and what's not. And now, just a quick note on this idea of expertise. And you'll find that this becomes relevant later on in the course when we talk about, late modern Western societies and a lack of trust in institutions like central government and experts. Now, expertise is more than just knowing certain facts and reading certain research. It's also about knowing how to interpret research findings, theories, and policies. You know, Sometimes you'll hear people say that the facts speak for themselves or that the data speaks for itself, but the reality is that these things need to be interpreted by skilled people who know how to make sense of them. And this knowledge isn't, um, you know, from books and reading alone. It's what we call tacit and experiential. It's difficult to put into words because expertise develops with close engagement with and contribution to a community of practitioners and experts. So, what that really means is that in developing your understandings of the materials in this course, it's important important to not just think, oh, I'll do this and that reading, but engage with the material and make a contribution to that discourse that could take the form of discussing things in class, asking questions, contributing to discussions online, and even the assessments that you complete are part of an ongoing conversation about the topic. Now, we come to this idea of prevention with a few implicit assumptions. The first is that crime can actually be prevented, right? It seems sort of intuitive, but that is an assumption. Um, that crime is a singular phenomenon or a singular object of focus. And what I'm getting at here is that we might want to think about how there are different types and forms of crime. You know, sometimes it's easy to fall into the trap of treating them all as the one same thing, but really, there's a diversity in a range of activities that are considered criminal and actors who are involved in that process. So we need to be mindful of falling into the trap of this singular kind of thinking. And I think that this will make a bit more sense next week as well and the week after. It also assumes that we can understand crime enough to actually prevent it, and that we can develop ways of preventing crime. It also assumes that there are particular forms of crime prevention that may be favored or deemed more or less acceptable or unacceptable. So there are implicit value judgments when we're dealing with this idea of prevention. Our vision of society and preferred forms of social control are all, embedded in our approach to the idea of prevention. Now, what I want to do at this point is introduce a film called Minority Report as an example to think through some of these ideas. Minority Report was directed by Steven Spielberg and stars Tom Cruise. Now, what's important here for our purposes is the premise of the film. It's set in the near future, and police use a form of psychic technology to arrest and convict criminals, specifically murderers, before they commit their crime. Now, what makes this movie a movie is that the head of this pre-crime unit is accused of the future murder of a man he hasn't met yet. Now, what's, you know, relevant about this movie as sort of an example is it gets us thinking about this idea of prevention and pre-crime. Now, this is an extreme form of prevention in the sense that in the film, um, people get arrested before they've even committed the crime, right? Now, we haven't got to that stage in our society, well, not yet anyway, but it gets us thinking about how, different techniques of crime prevention are premised on this idea that had this intervention not happened, a crime would have otherwise taken place. Now, this can open up sort of deeper philosophical considerations, but I'm going to spare you the navel gazing at this stage. And I just wanted to introduce this as an example of, extreme futuristic speculative crime prevention. Now, on the slide, I've got a link for the Minority Report film trailer, but what you might want to do instead is have a look at that trailer once you've finished the lecture, and you should be able to find that link on Views under the materials for week 1. But what I want you to do in the meantime is we've talked about this pre-crime approach, extreme prevention, intervening based on future knowledge to, prevent crime. And I might leave you with the following 2 questions to consider. At what level might a pre-crime style of approach prevent crime? And at what level might a pre-crime style of approach fail to prevent crime? What I'm getting at in these 2 questions is think about what this pre-crime approach assumes about the nature of crime and those involved. Now, I'm going to give you a minute. I'm going to leave that minute running up on the screen for you to make a few notes, think about the questions, and then in the next slide, I'll let you read through some of the types of answers you may have come up with, or that might help you thinking about this material further, basically. Now, moving on from that example, here are a few more things you might want to consider when thinking about the broad idea of crime prevention. Now, that is, how is crime determined and defined, and by whom? Who responds to which crimes? Now, this is, of course, in reference to issues around responsibilization, globalization, neoliberalism, and so on. Then you might want to think back to different theories about the causes of crime that you may have come across in other units, other criminology units, such as labeling theory, strain theories, the Chicago School, and urban ecology and sociology, and those sorts of things. Now, this is important to think about because this is again getting at some of these underlying assumptions that inform our theories and thinking behind crime prevention, and in turn, our practices of crime prevention. That is, what we end up doing to enact or try to enact crime prevention through policy, police practices, community practices, and so on. The question of who responds to which crimes is an important one for crime prevention thinking, because as we'll see next week and in future weeks, crime prevention, as it is currently understood and practiced, isn't solely the domain of routine police work. It has branched out to incorporate broader sections of the community, other institutions, organizations, and actors. And these, other sections of the community aren't always extensions of the state, i.e., the government, and so on. However, you know, crime prevention could still be an expression of underlying government policies and initiatives. Now, this leads into another set of questions and assumptions we might want to think about, and that is, how does this idea of community fit into all of this? Now, up on the screen, I've got 4 example questions to help get you thinking about this, and that is, are we talking about preventing crime at the community level? Are we preventing crimes that occur within the community? Are we preventing crimes with the help of the community? And are we preventing crimes to protect the community? Now, that's not to say that any one of these questions or approaches is the correct one, but it is to say that we need to think about what is being assumed when we discuss different theories and approaches of prevention. For example, if we're talking about preventing crime with the help of the community, or crimes occurring within the community, or at the community level, whatever these things all mean, it sort of says that certain crimes are probably, or maybe not, beyond the scope of this form of prevention. So, for example, environmental crime, transnational crime, are these sorts of things the purview of crime prevention as it is commonly understood and practiced? Now, the following slides build on this week's assigned reading and the idea of prevention. Crime prevention is actually embedded in many of our everyday practices. This includes, locking the car door, locking your front door when you leave the house. Maybe some of you have security cameras or live in an apartment building with, a locked entrance that needs a swipe access or something to that effect. This idea of everyday crime prevention is something you can also have a look at in another one of the links from this week, which is just a short YouTube video. So after you finish the lecture, you may want to have a look at that. Now, an important idea from the reading to take on board is this idea that crime prevention is not just an instrumental activity, that it has symbolic and affective dimensions. Now, what that means is that when we talk about instrumental, we're saying that crime prevention isn't just a set of techniques that we just sort of apply as though we were, using tools to repair something. There is also a symbolic dimension to crime prevention. Now, the reading talks about there being a social function of prevention, something encapsulated by this symbolic and affective dimension of crime prevention. And the social function includes developing a collective consciousness. Now, this links back to materials such as that of Durkheim, who talks about shared norms and normlessness or anomie. And what we might want to take away from these ideas from the reading is recognizing that crime prevention, aside from being this tool of managing society and managing crime, also has an element of it that relates back to the society communicating back to itself its own values and thoughts about what the ideal society should be, what forms of social control are acceptable, and so on. Building upon this talk of the symbolic and effective dimensions of crime prevention, we also need to think about crime prevention in its social and political context. This week's reading talks about how crime prevention ties in with the logic of what we call the post-welfare state. It fits in with this shift towards responsibilization and dispersed governance. Now, that includes rethinking and augmenting the habits, routines, and practices of agencies and organizations. Now, what it's getting at is saying that crime prevention does fit to some extent with the contemporary neoliberal social, political, and economic logic of our contemporary late capitalist societies, in the West at least. Now, we don't need to go into too much detail about that this week. There'll be more on that in week 2 and other weeks, I imagine. However, something else to think about that sort of ties in with our thinking about contemporary socio-political structures and arrangements is that there seems to be an unequal distribution of the benefits of crime prevention. A couple of points listed in the reading are the following: that socio-economically disadvantaged and marginalized communities experience disproportionately high rates of victimization and violence, and that less disadvantaged communities are the ones that are more likely to have economic, social, and cultural resources to effectively enact prevention strategies. Now, what that is getting at is saying that the way that prevention is socially and economically organized, I guess you could say, finds that those at greatest risk, those most marginalized communities, don't or can't access the same level of resources to enable effective prevention. Now, again, we don't need to go into too much detail about that this week, but it is about, raising our own awareness when we're thinking about the idea of crime prevention that, yeah, it's not just this simple, straightforward set of techniques or strategies, but that there is this sociological component to it, that there's a political component to it, and that it needs to be understood in its context. Now, necessarily, crime prevention also brings with it particular views about how we should approach the problem of crime. What prevention brings to the table is it helps move our, you know, intellectual fixation on deviance and offenders and move us sort of beyond just looking at that. And it helps us look at these broader factors, be they situational, environmental, structural, or systemic. Crime prevention also gets us, going beyond punitive responses to crime and thinking about some of the limits of a, purely punitive system, and instead get us thinking about other factors that go into the circumstances and relationships through which events or acts of crime materialize. This week's reading tentatively suggests a useful definition of crime prevention. So, this is probably what you've all been waiting for sitting through this first lecture. Now, it needs to be stated that this isn't the only possible definition, but in the view of the authors of this week's reading, this does become a useful definition for understanding the different theories and thinking behind different forms of crime prevention. And that definition that I've got up on the slide there says the total of all private initiatives and state policies other than the enforcement of criminal law aimed at the reduction of damage caused by acts defined as criminal by the state. We are going to want to keep that definition in the back of our mind as we go through other weeks and topics in the course, because it helps us, really take on board the fact that crime prevention involves a mix of private initiatives and state policies. And that when we talk about prevention, we're not talking about, for lack of a better phrase, the regular law enforcement practices. Before we wrap up the lecture, I just want to briefly go through the topics for this semester so that you have a sense of where this is all heading. Now, this week was just a brief and gentle introduction to the concept of crime prevention more broadly. Next week, we'll be looking at the theories and foundations of crime prevention. The week after that, we're going to be talking about the fear of crime, politics, and crime policy. And then the next few weeks after that, we'll be looking at some of the main schools of thought around crime prevention practices. So that means in week 4, we'll be talking about social and community crime prevention. Week 5, we will be looking at situational crime prevention. Week 6, crime prevention through environmental design. And week 7, we will be looking at preventive and community policing. Now, in week 8, we're going to talk about planning and crime prevention partnerships. And this links back to what was being said earlier in this lecture about how crime prevention is, outside of just regular law enforcement practices, that we're talking about a broader group of actors, including but not limited to the state or the government, but also private citizens, private enterprises, community groups, and so on. And these all operate in different ways in partnership with each other to achieve crime prevention outcomes. After the mid-session break, in week 10 we have a look at the crime prevention industry. Now this will most likely involve us taking into consideration some of the private enterprise aspects of crime prevention. And then week 11 we're going to look at alternative modes of crime prevention, in particular this idea of restorative justice and reintegrative shaming. Some of you may have touched upon this briefly in other criminology type courses, but now we're going to look at it in a bit more detail with regard to its function as a crime prevention technique. Week 12, we will look at evaluating crime prevention, and as will become clear in next week's lecture, the evaluation aspect is a very important aspect of crime prevention if it wants to be an evidence-based empirical approach to crime. And in week 13, we will look at the future of crime prevention. Now, I can't guarantee that it will be anything like Minority Report, but yeah, we'll see when we get there. Now, one final thing before we wrap up is let's have a quick chat about next week. Week 2, Theories and Foundations of Crime Prevention. Now, the assigned reading for that week is Sutton, Cherney and White, 2014, Chapter 2. And here are some things to think about when reading, studying, and preparing for next week's course. And that is, what is the difference between administrative and critical approaches? What is the difference between proximal and distal factors? And think about Felson's crime triangle model and X modification of that model. Now, these are only 3 of some of the main ideas that we will be discussing next week, but I like to just give a few pointers to help students guide their reading and help them, not go into the reading blind, so to speak. Also, don't forget to have a look at the online links for this week. Don't forget to make a note of when the assessments are due. And, of course, week 1 there are no face-to-face tutorials if you're doing the face-to-face version of the unit. Otherwise, yep, good luck, and I'll see you next week.